Welcome, time traveler. You've arrived in a world of ice-choked winds, hunger-bitten silence, and firelight prayers whispered into the void. Tonight, we step beyond the warrior myths into the raw, frostbitten reality of Viking survival. These weren't horned legends etched in saga. They were starving mothers, limping hunters, frost-cracked children clinging to warmth and life. You'll walk beside a father digging graves in frozen soil. Feel the brittle hope of a fire flickering in a snow-collapsed longhouse, and hear the desperate hush of prayers sent to gods who never answered. So pull your cloak tighter, breathe deep, and let the cold in, because this is how the Vikings survived the darkest nights of the year, the night that never ended. You've arrived in a world of ice-choked winds, hunger-bitten silence, and firelight prayers whispered into the void. Tonight, we step beyond the warrior myths into the raw, frostbitten reality of Viking survival. These weren't horned legends etched in saga. They were starving mothers, limping hunters, frost-cracked children, clinging to warmth and life. You'll walk beside a father digging graves in frozen soil. Feel the brittle hope of a fire flickering in a snow-collapsed longhouse, and hear the desperate hush of prayers sent to gods who never answered. So pull your cloak tighter, breathe deep, and let the cold in, because this is how the Vikings survived the darkest nights of the year. You're standing in a wooden longhouse in 9th century Norway, and the sun hasn't risen for 3 months. Outside, the wind howls like the voices of the dead. And the temperature has dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Your breath forms ice crystals that fall to the ground with tiny tinkling sounds. This is the reality of the polar night, a phenomenon that modern people can barely comprehend, where darkness reigns for up to 4 months in the far north. But you're not just any person struggling against this endless night. You're a Viking, and your ancestors have survived these conditions for over 1,000 years. What you're about to experience isn't just survival. It's descent into a world where reality blurs with madness, where the line between life and death becomes as thin as the ice forming on your eyelashes. The Norse called this period mørketid, the dark time. Modern psychiatrists have documented how prolonged darkness triggers severe depression, psychosis, and suicidal thoughts. But in 847 AD, there are no psychiatrists, no electric lights, no central heating. There's only you, your family, and the ancient knowledge passed down through generations of people who learned to thrive in conditions that would kill most humans within days. Archaeological evidence from sites like Borg and the Lofoten Islands reveals that Vikings didn't just endure these winters, they used them. The darkness became their ally, the cold their weapon. They understood something that modern civilization has forgotten, that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining your humanity when everything around you screams that you should give up. The Viking Age lasted from approximately 793 to 1066 AD. But their winter survival techniques were already ancient when the first longships touched foreign shores. Carbon dating of fire pits in Iceland shows continuous occupation through winters that lasted up to 5 months, with temperatures regularly reaching minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. These weren't just brief cold snaps. These were months of conditions that would shut down modern cities. You feel the weight of the furs on your shoulders, each one representing a successful hunt, a conquered animal, a small victory against the consuming darkness. The whale oil lamp flickers beside you, casting dancing shadows that seem almost alive. Your children sleep in the alcove, their breath visible in the frigid air even inside the house. They don't know that outside, the world has become something else entirely. A place where survival depends on rituals that would seem barbaric to modern eyes. The wooden walls creak and groan under the pressure of accumulated snow and ice. You can hear something moving outside, but in the polar night, you can never be sure if it's an animal, another human, or something else entirely. The Vikings believed that winter was when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead became thinnest. Tonight, you'll discover why they believe that. But first, you need to understand what it really means to face a winter that could last until spring. if spring ever comes at all. What you don't know yet is that survival will demand sacrifices that will change you forever. The architecture of survival, the longhouse, engineering for the apocalypse. You run your hand along the massive wooden beam supporting the roof above your head. This single piece of timber, a Norwegian spruce that lived for over 200 years, represents more than construction. It's a lifeline engineered by people who understood that winter wasn't just a season, it was a siege that lasted months. The longhouse you're standing in stretches nearly 100 feet in length. But what you can't see is the genius hidden in its construction. Archaeological excavations at Borg reveal that these buildings were designed like medieval submarines, completely. Sealed environments where every cubic foot of air was precious. The walls are double layered with birch bark sandwiched between wooden planks, creating an insulation system that maintains internal temperatures up to 60 degrees warmer than outside. But the most disturbing discovery lies beneath your feet. The floor isn't just packed earth, it's layers of compressed animal bones, human waste, and rotting organic matter that's been fermenting for generations. This isn't poor sanitation. It's biological engineering. The decomposition process generates heat through bacterial action, creating a form of underfloor heating that keeps the longhouse warm even when the fires die down. Carbon dating of floor samples from Icelandic longhouses shows that families lived above this rotting foundation for decades. Adding new layers each winter, the smell would be overwhelming to modern senses. But Vikings developed a tolerance that allowed them to survive in conditions that would otherwise be lethal. They literally lived on top of decay to stay alive. The roof above you is covered with turf, not just for insulation, but because living grass continues to generate heat, even under snow. Archaeological evidence shows that some longhouses had root systems growing through the ceiling, creating a symbiotic relationship between the building and the living ecosystem on top of it. You're not just inside a house. You're inside a living organism designed to survive the unsurvivable. The windows are made from scraped animal membranes or thin sheets of ice, replaced regularly as they crack and fog. But window placement follows a pattern that modern architects are only beginning to understand. Each opening is positioned to maximize the capture of any available light while minimizing heat loss. The Vikings were solar engineers centuries before the term existed. The most ingenious feature is the central hearth, not just a fire pit, but a complex system of channels and chambers that circulate heated air throughout the structure. Smoke doesn't just escape through a hole in the roof. It travels through a network of passages that transfer heat to every corner of the building before finally being released outside. This system was so efficient that Vikings could maintain comfortable temperatures while burning only a fraction of the fuel that similar-sized modern buildings would require. But the true test of this engineering marvel wasn't just keeping people warm, it was keeping them sane. Modern studies of isolation show that prolonged confinement in small spaces leads to cabin fever, violence, and psychological breakdown. The longhouse was designed to prevent these problems through architectural psychology that wouldn't be understood by modern science for another 1,000 years. You notice the subtle curves in the walls, the way the ceiling height varies, the strategic placement of support beams that create natural gathering spaces and private alcoves. Every element was crafted to maintain social harmony when families were trapped together for months. But even the most perfect shelter couldn't protect against what happened when the food ran out. The feast before the famine, harvest festivals, and the psychology of abundance. You're sitting at a wooden table that groans under the weight of an impossible feast. It's late September, 891 AD, and the longhouse is filled with the aroma of roasted meat, fermented fish, and honey mead. This isn't just dinner. It's a carefully orchestrated psychological preparation for the months of deprivation ahead. The Vikings understood something about human psychology that modern science has only recently rediscovered. The memory of abundance can sustain people through periods of scarcity. Archaeological evidence from Hedeby shows that Viking communities held elaborate harvest festivals that lasted for weeks. consuming vast quantities of food that would seem wasteful to modern eyes. But these weren't celebrations of excess. They were strategic investments in mental survival. The human brain forms stronger memories when emotions are heightened, and the Vikings knew that creating powerful memories of plenty would help there. Families endure the psychological torture of winter rationing. The centerpiece of tonight's feast is a whole roasted aurochs, a massive wild ox that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed over 2,000 pounds. These animals went extinct in 1627, but in your time, they represent the ultimate hunting prize. The aurochs before you required the coordinated effort of dozens of hunters and took 3 days to bring down. Its meat will feed the entire community for weeks, but more importantly, the memory of this feast will sustain morale through the darkest months ahead, but there's a darker purpose to this abundance. Medieval texts from Iceland describe how Viking families would deliberately gorge themselves before winter, adding layers of fat that would serve as emergency energy reserves. This wasn't gluttony, it was biological preparation for starvation. Modern studies of famine survivors show that people who enter periods of scarcity with higher body fat percentages have significantly better survival rates and maintain better mental health. The mead flowing freely around the table contains honey that represents months of careful bee management. Vikings were skilled apiarists who understood that bees could survive winter if properly managed, providing both honey and the alcohol that would serve as medicine, antiseptic, and psychological comfort during the dark months. The alcohol content of Viking mead was significantly higher than modern versions, reaching up to 20% alcohol by volume because they needed it to prevent freezing and to serve as a concentrated source of calories. The most disturbing tradition involves the blood bread, loaves made from grain mixed with fresh animal blood. This wasn't just a protein supplement. It was a deliberate psychological conditioning. By consuming blood during times of plenty, Vikings prepared their minds and bodies for the possibility that they might need to consume it during times of desperation. Archaeological evidence suggests that winter survival sometimes required drinking fresh blood from livestock to prevent scurvy when vegetables were unavailable. The children around you laugh and play, but the adults exchange knowing glances. Everyone understands that this might be the last time the family eats together until spring. The elderly, in particular, carry a weight in their eyes that speaks of winters where not everyone survived until the thaw. As the night progresses, you notice that certain family members eat less than others. Despite the abundance, the strategic distribution of food is already beginning, a complex social ritual that will determine who lives and who dies in the months ahead. But tonight, that reality feels impossibly distant. Tonight, there's only warmth, light, and the illusion that winter might never come. The morning will shatter that illusion forever. The last light, October 28, 934 AD, when the sun dies you. Wake before dawn on what will be the last morning you see the sun for 4 months. The date is October 28, 934 AD, and you're standing outside your longhouse in northern Norway, watching the sky turn a deep purple that seems to swallow the world. This isn't just a sunset, it's a death. The sun will barely clear the horizon today, casting long shadows that stretch for miles before disappearing until February. Modern people can't comprehend what you're witnessing. In our world, even the darkest winter day still has hours of sunlight, but you're experiencing something that affects less than 1% of the world's population today. The complete absence of the sun for months at a time. Psychiatric studies of modern Arctic residents show that even with artificial lighting, the psychological impact of polar night causes a 300% increase in suicide rates, severe depression in 67% of the population, and psychotic episodes in 23% of individuals. But you don't have artificial lighting, you have only fire. And fire requires fuel that must last until spring. The ritual you're participating in has been practiced for over 1,000 years. Archaeological evidence from CME settlements shows that Arctic peoples held elaborate ceremonies on the day of the last sunrise. creating communal memories that would sustain them through the darkness. Every member of the community gathers to witness the sun's death, speaking aloud their hopes for its return. This isn't superstition. It's a sophisticated psychological technique for maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming despair. The children around you don't understand what they're seeing. For them, this is just another day. But you know that by the time they see the sun again, some of them will be dead. Winter mortality rates in medieval Scandinavia reached 30% in harsh years, with children and elderly being the most vulnerable. The ritual of the last sunrise is also a ritual of saying goodbye to those who might not survive. The sun hangs impossibly low on the horizon, casting a red light that makes the snow look like blood. The temperature has already dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will continue falling for weeks. Your breath forms clouds that instantly freeze and fall to the ground with tiny crystalline sounds. This is the sound of winter, not just cold, but the actual freezing of the air you breathe. What's most disturbing is the silence. As the sun disappears, the world becomes impossibly quiet. Snow absorbs sound. And most animals have either migrated or entered hibernation. The only sounds are the wind, the creaking of ice, and the distant howl of wolves. This silence will become a psychological torture device. Broken only by the sounds of your own family, their breathing, their movements, their gradual descent. Into winter madness, the Vikings believed that the sun's death was a battle between light and darkness. With no guarantee that light would win, they weren't wrong. Solar astronomical data shows that medieval Europe experienced a period called the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age. Some winters were so severe that the sun's return was delayed by weeks beyond its normal schedule. As the last sliver of sunlight disappears, you feel something inside you change. The part of your mind that exists in the daylight world begins to shut down, replaced by something older, more primitive. The part that knows how to survive in the realm of eternal night. The darkness that follows isn't just an absence of light. It's a presence that has its own weight, its own rules, its own hunger, and it's just beginning. The rituals of sanity, daily ceremonies to prevent madness, you awaken complete darkness, but your body knows it's morning. How? Because for the past 3 weeks, you've been following a ritual so precise that your internal clock has adapted to the absence of natural light. This isn't just routine. It's a psychological survival technique that the Vikings developed over centuries to prevent the complete mental breakdown that accompanies prolonged darkness. The ritual begins before you even open your eyes. You count to 60 slowly, deliberately, while still lying in your sleeping furs. Modern sleep research shows that the sudden awakening in darkness triggers cortisol spikes that can lead to panic attacks and depression. The Vikings discovered that counting upon waking gives the brain time to adjust to consciousness without the trauma of immediate awareness that the sun still hasn't returned. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements reveals that Vikings maintained elaborate daily schedules during polar night, with specific activities assigned to specific times despite the absence of any natural time cues. They divided the day into 8 distinct periods, each marked by different activities: fire tending, storytelling, weapon maintenance, textile work, food preparation, physical exercise, spiritual observances, and sleep. This structure wasn't just organizational. It was psychiatric treatment. The most important daily ritual involves the flame ceremony. Every morning, the entire family gathers around the central hearth while the eldest member recites the same words spoken by their ancestors for generations. The fire lives. We live. The fire dies. We die. The fire returns. We return. This isn't religious doctrine. It's a psychological, anchoring technique that reinforces the connection between survival and hope. But the most disturbing ritual involves the daily counting of the living. Each family member must speak their name aloud and confirm they're still alive. This sounds morbid, but winter psychosis can cause people to become convinced they are dead, leading to catatonic states that can actually cause death. The naming ritual forces each person to maintain their identity and connection to reality. Medieval. Icelandic texts describe how some individuals would enter winter silence, a psychological state where they stopped speaking entirely, sometimes for months. The daily naming ritual was designed to prevent this condition, which had a mortality rate of nearly 80%. If someone failed to speak their name 3 days in a row, the family would perform an intervention ritual involving physical stimulation, forced feeding, and constant verbal engagement till the person returned to responsiveness. The Vikings also practiced light fasting, deliberately limiting exposure to firelight during certain periods to prevent their eyes from becoming too sensitive to brightness. People who spent the entire winter in constant artificial light would become blind when exposed to sunlight again in spring. The regulated exposure to darkness was actually training their eyes to function in both conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, they practiced cold meditation, deliberately exposing themselves to freezing temperatures for short periods while maintaining complete mental control. This wasn't masochism. It was training their minds to function during the inevitable times when the fire would die down or when they would need to venture outside. Modern studies of cold therapy show that controlled exposure to extreme cold can actually improve mental resilience and reduce depression. The daily rituals weren't just about surviving winter. They were about maintaining enough sanity to function when spring returned. Because Vikings who lost their minds to winter darkness often never recovered, even after the sun came back. But maintaining sanity required more than just daily rituals. It required understanding the deeper truths about what humans become when civilization disappears. The Hunger Games, when food becomes currency and families become strangers holding a piece of dried fish that weighs exactly 3 ounces. It's December 15th, 902 AD, and this small piece of protein represents your entire food allocation. For the next 2 days, the person rationing it to you is your own brother. But the look in his eyes is that of a stranger calculating whether you're worth keeping alive. This is how winter transforms families. Modern psychology has extensively documented how extreme scarcity changes human behavior. But the Vikings lived this reality for months at a time. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that food storage areas were often locked and guarded. Not against outsiders, but against family members. Winter wasn't just a season. It was a psychological experiment in how long people could maintain their humanity while slowly starving. The rationing system you're experiencing was developed over centuries of trial and error. Adult males received the largest portions because they were needed for hunting and heavy labor. Adult women received slightly less, but pregnant women received more than anyone. Children received portions based on their age and their likelihood of surviving until spring. The elderly received the smallest portions, and those who became too weak to contribute were sometimes given even less. This wasn't cruelty, it was mathematics. Medieval texts from Iceland describe families where maintaining everyone at semi-starvation levels meant everyone would die. While strategic rationing meant that some could survive, the psychological trauma of making these calculations fell on the family patriarch, who had to decide daily who would eat and who would go hungry. The most disturbing aspect of Viking winter rationing was the hunger hierarchy, a social structure that determined who ate first, who ate last, and who didn't eat at all. This hierarchy wasn't based on love or family relationships, but on survival value. The blacksmith ate before the storyteller. The hunter ate before the weaver. The young ate before the old. The strong ate before the weak. Archaeological analysis of human remains from harsh winter periods shows evidence of controlled starvation. People who died with specific nutritional deficiencies that suggest their food was being carefully limited rather than completely withheld. This indicates that families were managing the dying process, allowing people to live longer on smaller amounts of food rather than letting them eat freely and die quickly. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Medieval Icelandic sagas describe how winter changed people's personalities permanently. Brothers who had been close their entire lives would become bitter enemies over food allocation. Mothers would begin to view their own children as competition for resources. The social bonds that held communities together during the summer would dissolve into a survival calculation where everyone was constantly evaluating everyone else's worth. But the most haunting aspect of winter rationing was the feast dreams. Vivid hallucinations of food that plagued starving people. These weren't just hungry thoughts. They were elaborate sensory experiences where people could taste, smell, and feel the food they were imagining. Some people became so lost in these dreams that they would refuse real food when it was offered, claiming they had already eaten. The Vikings developed specific techniques for managing these hallucinations, including group storytelling sessions where people would describe elaborate meals in detail, allowing everyone to experience the psychological satisfaction of eating without consuming actual food. These shared food fantasies became a form of psychological nourishment that helped people endure the physical reality of starvation. But even the most careful rationing couldn't prevent what happened when the stores ran out completely. When that happened, survival demanded choices that would haunt families for generations. The blood harvest. When animals become medicine and desperation becomes wisdom. You're standing in a wooden stall, holding a clay bowl beneath the neck of a cow that's barely alive. The animal is so weak from winter starvation that it can barely stand, but it's still breathing. And breathing animals have blood, the liquid that will keep your family alive for another few days. This practice, called bloodletting, was how Vikings extracted nutrition from their livestock without killing them, because dead animals can't produce more blood. The technique you're performing was developed over centuries of winter survival. Archaeological evidence from Faroe Island settlements shows that Vikings would open small veins in their cattle, sheep, and goats, collecting 2 to 3 pints of blood at a time while keeping the animals alive. The blood was then mixed with grain to create a pudding-like substance that provided essential proteins and vitamins that prevented scurvy, anemia, and other diseases that killed people who relied solely on preserved meat. But this isn't just animal blood. Medieval texts from Iceland describe how Vikings would also perform bloodletting on themselves and their family members. Not for medical reasons, but for nutrition during the worst famines. Families would take turns bleeding into communal bowls, sharing their own blood to keep the weakest members alive. This wasn't vampirism. It was a calculated medical intervention, based on the understanding that blood contains nutrients that can prevent death from malnutrition. The most disturbing aspect of blood consumption was the psychological impact. People who regularly consume blood during winter often develop what medieval texts describe as blood hunger, a psychological craving for the taste and texture of blood that persisted long after winter ended. Some individuals would continue seeking blood even when other food was available, leading to social problems and, in some cases, violent behavior. Modern nutritional analysis shows that the Vikings' blood consumption was scientifically sound. Blood contains high levels of iron, protein, and vitamin B12, nutrients that are essential for survival but are often lacking in preserved winter foods. A single cup of blood contains more protein than a pound of dried fish and enough iron to prevent anemia for weeks. The Vikings had discovered what modern survival experts now teach: that blood is one of the most nutritionally complete foods available. The process of blood collection was ritualized to maintain sanity. Families would gather around the bleeding animal or person, sharing stories and maintaining conversation to normalize what was happening. The blood was always consumed immediately while still warm, and everyone participated equally. No one was exempt from drinking, even children. This communal consumption prevented the psychological isolation that could occur when individuals were forced to consume blood alone. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking families became so dependent on blood consumption that they would deliberately weaken their animals to make bloodletting easier, creating a cycle where the animals became less useful for other purposes. This led to what scholars call blood farming, the practice of keeping animals, specifically for their blood rather than their meat. milk or labor, the long-term consequences of blood consumption were significant. Medieval medical texts describe how people who consume large amounts of blood develop specific health problems, including digestive issues, iron poisoning, and psychological disturbances. Some individuals would become violent when blood was not available, leading to family conflicts and community disruption. But even blood wasn't enough when the truly desperate times arrived, when the animals died and the blood ran out. Survival required crossing lines that would change people forever. The broken taboos, when civilization ends and survival begins. Our looking at the body of your neighbor, Eric the blacksmith, who died 3 days ago. His wife, Astrid, is standing beside you with a bone knife in her hand and her eyes hold. A question that no one should ever have to ask. The winter has been so harsh that the normal burial ground is frozen solid. The food stores are empty, and Eric's body represents the only source of protein available to keep her children alive. This is the moment when Viking society crossed into territory that would be unthinkable in normal times. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows clear signs of cannibalism during the worst winters, with human bones that bear the distinctive marks of deliberate butchering. This wasn't ritual behavior or cultural practice. It was the mathematical reality of survival when all other options were exhausted. The Vikings had developed specific protocols for this situation. Medieval Icelandic texts describe how communities would hold formal councils to decide when cannibalism was justified, creating legal frameworks for something that would normally be considered the ultimate taboo. These weren't spontaneous decisions driven by madness. They were calculated. Community choices made by people who understood that some would die regardless, and that their deaths could prevent others from dying. The psychological preparation for cannibalism began long before it became necessary. Viking families would tell stories about ancestors who survived harsh winters through any means necessary, creating mental frameworks that normalized extreme survival measures. Children were taught that the body was just meat, and that the spirit of the deceased would want their flesh to keep the living alive. This wasn't just practical education, it was psychological conditioning for the unthinkable. The most disturbing aspect of Viking cannibalism was the systematic nature of the practice. Bodies would be processed in specific ways to maximize nutrition while minimizing psychological trauma. The head, hands, and feet were usually buried separately to maintain the humanity of the deceased. The meat was always cooked thoroughly and shared equally among all family members. No one was allowed to eat alone, and everyone was required to participate in the consumption to distribute the psychological burden. Archaeological analysis of cooking sites from harsh winter periods shows evidence of human bone. Marrow extraction, a process that requires specific tools and techniques to access the highly nutritious marrow inside bones. This indicates that Viking cannibalism wasn't just desperate consumption of flesh, but sophisticated processing of human remains to extract maximum nutritional value. The social consequences of cannibalism were severe but manageable within Viking culture. Families who resorted to eating the dead were not ostracized if they followed proper protocols, but they were marked as winter-touched, people who had crossed into the realm of the dead and returned. This status carried both respect for their survival and wariness about their psychological state. Medieval texts describe how people who consumed human flesh often develop what was called death hunger, a psychological condition where they would continue to crave human meat even after other food became available. Some individuals would become fixated on the taste and texture of human flesh, leading to violent behavior and social disruption. The Vikings developed specific rituals for cleansing people who had consumed human flesh, including extended periods of fasting and spiritual purification. But the most haunting aspect of Viking cannibalism was the selection process. When starvation reached critical levels, families had to decide who would be eaten first, usually the elderly or those who were already dying. This decision-making process created psychological trauma that lasted for generations. The question facing Astrid isn't just whether to eat Eric's body, it's whether she can live with the memory of doing so. The children of winter, how the young survived when adults failed. Watching a 7-year-old girl named Sigrid calmly skin a rabbit while her parents huddle in the corner, paralyzed by winter depression. It's January 15th, 856 AD, and Sigrid has become the functional head of her household because children's brains, it turns out, are far better equipped to handle extreme survival situations than adult minds. This isn't just about resilience, it's about neurology. Modern research shows that children's brains are more plastic and adaptable than adult brains. But the Vikings discovered this truth through brutal experience. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that in harsh winters, children often had better survival rates than adults. Not because they were given more food, but because they were better at finding food. Adapting to extreme conditions and maintaining psychological stability in the face of horror, Sigrid learned to hunt rabbits by the age of 5, not through formal training, but through observation and trial and error. She can identify edible plants buried under snow, track animals by scent, and process meat more efficiently than adults who have been paralyzed by the psychological trauma of winter survival. Her hands are small enough to reach into animal burrows. Her body requires less food to maintain, and her mind hasn't yet developed the psychological barriers that prevent adults from doing what's necessary to survive. The most disturbing aspect of childhood winter survival was the phenomenon of winter children, kids who thrived in conditions that broke their parents. These children would become incredibly skilled at tasks that would horrify modern people. Butchering animals, processing blood, identifying which family members were dying and which were worth saving resources on. They developed a calculating coldness that was necessary for survival, but disturbing to witness. Medieval Icelandic texts describe how winter children would sometimes make survival decisions that their parents couldn't make. They would decide when to stop feeding elderly family members, when to put sick animals out of their misery, and when to abandon damaged equipment that adults were too emotionally attached to discard. These decisions weren't made with malice. They were made with the clarity of minds that hadn't yet learned to value sentiment over survival. The psychological cost of this childhood adaptation was severe. Children who survived brutal winters often develop what medieval texts called ice hearts, an inability to form normal emotional attachments or experience empathy in typical ways. They would become incredibly competent adults, but would struggle with relationships, emotional expression, and social bonds that required vulnerability. Archaeological evidence shows that winter children often became the leaders of their communities in adulthood, but they also had significantly higher rates of violence, isolation, and what modern psychology would recognize as antisocial behavior. They had learned to survive by turning off their emotional responses, and many never learned to turn them back on. The most tragic aspect of winter child survival was the relationship between these children and their parents. Parents who had been saved by their children's competence often developed deep shame and resentment that lasted for years. Children who had been forced to become adults during winter often lost the ability to be children again, creating family dynamics that were permanently altered by the survival experience. Sigrid finishes skinning the rabbit and begins preparing it for cooking. Her movements precise and efficient. Her parents watch her with a mixture of gratitude and horror, knowing that their 7-year-old daughter has become more capable than they are. But Sigrid is paying a price for her competence that won't become apparent until decades later, when she struggles to love her own children. The madness of endless night, when minds break and reality becomes fluid. You're sitting across from your brother Magnus, but the person staring back at you isn't Magnus anymore. His eyes are vacant, his mouth moves constantly without producing sound, and he's been building small structures out of bones and stones for the past 3 days. This is winter madness, and it's spreading through your longhouse like a disease. It's February 3rd, 891 AD, and you're witnessing what happens when human minds are pushed beyond their breaking point by months of darkness and isolation. Modern psychiatry has extensively documented the psychological effects of prolonged darkness and isolation. But the Vikings lived these conditions as a routine part of survival. Archaeological evidence from Greenland. Settlements shows that some longhouses contain isolation chambers, small rooms, where people experiencing winter madness were confined. To prevent them from harming others or themselves, these weren't cruel punishments. They were medical interventions designed to protect both the afflicted individual and the community. The condition you're witnessing was called winter wraiths by the Vikings, people who were physically alive but mentally existed in some other realm. Modern psychology would recognize this as severe dissociative disorder, combined with seasonal affective disorder and sensory deprivation psychosis. The symptoms were predictable. First came the silence, then the repetitive behaviors, then the complete disconnection from reality. Magnus hasn't spoken for 6 days, but he's been incredibly active, creating elaborate constructions from available materials. These aren't random arrangements. They're complex patterns that seem to follow. Some internal logic that only he understands. Medieval texts describe how people in winter madness would often become obsessed with creating spirit houses, structures that they believed were necessary to shelter the souls of the dead who couldn't find rest in the frozen ground. The most disturbing aspect of winter madness was how contagious it seemed to be. When one person in a longhouse descended into psychosis, others would often follow within days. This wasn't just psychological suggestion. It was the result of shared environmental stressors that pushed multiple people past their breaking points simultaneously. The darkness, cold, malnutrition, and isolation created perfect conditions for mass psychological breakdown. Archaeological analysis of items found in winter settlements shows evidence of what scholars call madness artifacts, objects that were clearly created by people in psychotic states. These include elaborately carved bones with no practical purpose, stone arrangements that follow obsessive patterns, and textile work that becomes increasingly abstract and chaotic. These artifacts suggest that winter madness wasn't just destructive, it was also creative, channeling psychological breakdown into artistic expression. The Vikings developed specific techniques for managing winter madness. Families would assign watchers, people responsible for monitoring the mental state of others and intervening when someone began showing signs of psychological breakdown. These watchers would engage the afflicted person in conversation, physical activity, or creative work to keep their minds anchored to reality. But the most effective treatment was often the most brutal: controlled exposure to extreme cold. People experiencing winter madness would be taken outside and exposed to freezing temperatures until the shock brought them back to awareness. This technique, called ice awakening, was dangerous and sometimes fatal. But it was often the only way to break through the psychological barrier that separated the afflicted from reality. Magnus suddenly stops building his bone structure and looks directly at you. For a moment, his eyes seem to focus and you think, he's returning to himself, but then he speaks, and the words that come out aren't in any language you recognize. The language of spirits, when the dead speak through the living, the sounds coming from Magnus's mouth aren't words. There's something else entirely. He's speaking in a rhythm that rises and falls like music. But the syllables don't correspond to any Norse dialect, His voice has changed too, becoming higher and more melodic, as if someone else is using his vocal cords. This is spirit speech, and it's one of the most disturbing aspects of winter madness. Medieval Icelandic texts describe how people experiencing severe winter psychosis would begin speaking in dead tongues, languages that seem to come from somewhere else entirely. Modern linguistic analysis of recorded examples shows that these weren't random gibberish, but structured communication systems with consistent grammar and vocabulary. The speakers weren't just making sounds, they were receiving and transmitting information in languages that existed only in their altered states of consciousness. Archaeological evidence from Sami settlements shows that Arctic peoples recognize spirit speech as a form of communication with the dead. They believed that winter was when the boundary between the living and dead became thinnest, and that people experiencing winter madness were actually serving as mediums through which the deceased could communicate with the living. This wasn't superstition. It was a sophisticated understanding of how extreme psychological states could produce phenomena. That seems supernatural. The most disturbing aspect of spirit speech was its accuracy. People speaking in dead tongues would often reveal information that they couldn't possibly know. Details about deceased family members, locations of hidden objects, and events that had occurred before they were born. Modern psychology would explain this as the accessing of suppressed memories or unconscious knowledge. But in the context of Viking winter survival, it seemed like genuine communication with the dead. Magnus continues speaking in his otherworldly language, and you realize that other family members are beginning to respond. They're not speaking in spirit speech themselves, but they're nodding, reacting as if they understand what he's saying. This is the most frightening part. The possibility that the language isn't meaningless, that something is actually being communicated. The Vikings developed specific protocols for handling spirit speech. The afflicted person would be allowed to speak uninterrupted for as long as necessary, while family members recorded what was said using a runic notation system designed specifically for capturing non-Norse languages. These recordings were kept as family records and consulted during future winters when important decisions needed to be made. Archaeological evidence from Norway shows that some families maintained spirit libraries, collections of recordings from multiple generations of family members who had experienced winter madness. These libraries were considered sacred and were often consulted by community leaders when making decisions about survival strategies, resource allocation, and winter preparations. The psychological impact of spirit speech extended beyond the immediate family. When someone began speaking in dead tongues, word would spread throughout the community, and people would travel significant distances to hear what the spirits were saying. This created a form of winter entertainment that served important social functions. It brought people together, provided distraction from the harsh conditions, and created shared experiences that strengthened community bonds. But spirit speech also had darker implications. People who spoke in dead tongues often revealed family secrets, hidden conflicts, and suppressed memories that damaged relationships and created long-lasting feuds. The information that emerged during these episodes wasn't always welcome, and families sometimes had to deal with the consequences of truth that should have remained buried. The most haunting aspect of spirit speech was what happened when it stopped. People who had been speaking in dead tongues for days or weeks would suddenly return to normal consciousness with no memory of what they had said. They would look around at their family members' faces and know that something significant had happened, but they would be unable to access the memories of their experience. Magnus suddenly stops speaking and looks directly at you with clear, focused eyes. He opens his mouth to speak in normal Norse, but before he can say anything, you hear a sound that makes your blood freeze. Someone is knocking on the door of the longhouse. The visitors in the night, when strangers arrive in the impossible. Dark, the knocking comes again. 3 deliberate strikes against the wooden door. Your heart pounds because you know this is impossible. The nearest settlement is 40 miles, away through terrain that would kill anyone who attempted to cross it in winter darkness. Yet someone is outside, and they're knocking with the patience of someone who knows they'll be welcomed inside. This is how you discover one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking winter survival. The strangers who appeared during the darkest months. Medieval Icelandic texts describe how families would regularly receive unexpected visitors. During winter, people who shouldn't exist, traveling under conditions that should be lethal, arriving at settlements that should be impossible to find. In the darkness, archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that longhouses were built with specific protocols for winter visitors. Extra sleeping spaces were always maintained. Additional food stores were kept in reserve, and weapons were strategically placed near entrances. These weren't just preparations for friendly guests, they were security measures for encounters. that might not be what they seemed. The knocking stops, and you hear a voice calling in perfect Norse. I seek shelter from the storm. I have news from the south and gifts to the family. The voice is male, middle-aged, and speaks with the accent of someone from your home region, but there's no storm tonight. And no one from the south could possibly be traveling in these conditions? This is the moment when Viking winter survival becomes something more than just enduring cold and hunger, the psychological stress of isolation, darkness. And starvation can produce shared hallucinations, experiences that multiple people perceive simultaneously, but that have no basis in reality. Modern psychology calls this philia familial, a form of mass psychosis that affects entire families living in extreme isolation. But the Vikings believed these visitors were real, and they had developed specific protocols for dealing with them. The first rule was never to open the door immediately. The visitor would be questioned extensively through the wooden barrier. Asked to provide information that only a real person could know, they would be required to recite genealogies, describe specific landmarks, and provide details about mutual acquaintances. The second rule was that if the visitor passed the questioning, they would be allowed inside, but would be watched constantly. They would be given food and shelter, but they would never be left alone with any family member. Weapons would be kept within reach, and the visitor would be required to sleep in the central area where everyone could observe them. The third rule was the most disturbing. If the visitor failed to eat, drink, or sleep like a normal person, they would be asked to leave at dawn. If they refused to leave, they would be forced out using whatever means necessary. Archaeological evidence shows that some longhouses contained restraining devices and weapons specifically designed for subduing supernatural visitors. The voice outside calls again, and this time it mentions your name and the names of your family members. It describes the interior of your longhouse in detail and asks about relatives who died years ago. The information is accurate, but the tone of the voice has changed. It's becoming more insistent, more demanding. Your brother Magnus, who just recovered from his spirit speech episode, whispers a warning. Don't let it in. It's not here for shelter, it's here for something else. The familiar stranger. When the dead return wearing known faces, you recognize the voice now. It's your father, Olaf, who died 3 winters ago and whose body you buried under stones when the ground was too frozen for proper burial. He's calling your name with the same tone he used when you were a child, asking to come in from the cold just like he did countless times when he was alive. But your father's dead. And dead men don't travel 40 miles through winter darkness to visit their families. This is the phenomenon that Viking winter survivors feared most. The return of the familiar dead. Medieval texts from Iceland describe how families would regularly receive visits from deceased relatives during the darkest months. Encounters that were so realistic that people would question whether their loved ones had actually died. These weren't just hallucinations, they were shared experiences that affected entire families simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that some longhouses contained ghost barriers. Specific architectural features designed to prevent or control supernatural visitors. These included iron nails driven into door frames, salt lines across thresholds, and mirrors placed at strategic angles to reflect the spirits back outside. The Vikings understood that winter isolation could produce psychological phenomena that felt completely real. The voice outside becomes more insistent, and you hear details that only your real father could know. The location of hidden silver, the names of your childhood friends, the story of how you got the scar on your left hand. The information is completely accurate, but something about the tone is wrong. It's too perfect, too complete, as if someone is reciting memorized facts rather than sharing genuine memories. Modern psychology explains these experiences as grief hallucinations. Combined with the effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation, the human brain, deprived of normal social contact and environmental stimulation, begins to create its own reality using stored memories and unconscious knowledge. These hallucinations can be so convincing that multiple people experience them simultaneously, creating shared false memories that feel completely real. But the Vikings believed these visits were genuine contact with the dead, and they developed specific protocols for testing the authenticity of deceased visitors. The first test was physical. Spirits couldn't manipulate physical objects in the same way living people could. The second test was knowledge. Spirits would know things that had happened before their death, but wouldn't know about events that occurred afterward. The third test was emotional. Spirits would lack the full range of human emotions and would seem flat or hollow in their responses. Your father's voice passes the knowledge test but fails the emotional test. He speaks about your mother with perfect accuracy, but without the warmth that characterized their relationship when he was alive. He mentions your achievements with pride, but without the genuine emotional engagement that a living father would display. The most disturbing aspect of these visits was their persistence. Once a familiar spirit began visiting, it would often return repeatedly throughout the winter, becoming more demanding and more intrusive with each encounter. Some families reported that deceased relatives would become angry when denied entry, threatening violence or promising to return with other spirits. The knocking stops suddenly, and the voice outside changes. It's no longer your father's voice, it's your mother's. And she's calling for her children to come outside and play in the snow. But your mother is still alive, sleeping in the alcove just 10 feet away from where you're standing. The doppelganger trap: when the living become their own worst enemy, you look toward the alcove where your mother sleeps, and her bed is empty. The furs are cold, as if she's been gone for hours. But you never heard her leave. The voice outside is definitely hers, not just the sound, but the speech patterns, the particular way she pronounces your name, the intimate tone she uses when speaking to her children. But if your mother is outside, where has she been, and why is she asking you to come out into the deadly cold? This is the most psychologically devastating aspect of Viking winter survival. The appearance of living family members in impossible circumstances. Medieval Icelandic texts describe how families would encounter walking doubles, perfect copies, of living relatives who would appear outside the longhouse during winter nights, speaking and acting exactly like the real person, but attempting to lure family members into the fatal cold. Archaeological evidence from semi-settlements shows that Arctic peoples recognize this phenomenon as a form of spiritual warfare, where malevolent entities would assume the appearance of loved ones to prey on family bonds and emotional attachments. They believe that winter darkness weakened the boundary between the living and the dead, allowing hostile spirits to impersonate the living with perfect accuracy. The voice outside, your mother's voice, begins to sound distressed. She's calling for help, saying she's lost and cold, begging to be let inside. The emotional manipulation is perfect because it's using your deepest psychological vulnerabilities against you. Every instinct screams that you should open the door and help your mother. But your rational mind knows that your mother would never be outside in these conditions. Modern psychology explains doppelganger experiences as a form of psychological projection where the mind creates external versions of internal conflicts. The stress of winter survival creates intense guilt about family members who might be suffering. And this guilt manifests as hallucinations of those people in distress. The brain literally creates scenarios where family members need rescue, allowing the individual to either act on their protective instincts or experience the guilt of failing to help. But the Vikings understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to recognize: that these experiences could be shared by multiple people simultaneously, creating collective false memories that were indistinguishable from reality. Entire families would witness the same doppelganger event, hearing the same voice, seeing the same figure, and experiencing the same emotional manipulation. The most dangerous aspect of doppelganger encounters was their psychological accuracy. The false version of your mother isn't just mimicking her voice. It's demonstrating knowledge of family secrets, personal histories, and intimate details that only the real person could know. This suggests that the hallucination is accessing deep psychological information stored in the minds of the observers. creating a version of the person that's more complete and accurate than conscious memory alone could produce. You hear your mother's voice becoming more urgent, more desperate. She's crying now, begging for her children to help her, promising that she's not allowed inside. The emotional pressure is overwhelming, and you feel yourself moving toward the door despite knowing that opening it could be fatal. But then you hear something that stops you cold, a second voice outside. Also your mother's voice, having a conversation with the first voice. Two identical versions of your mother are talking to each other in the darkness beyond your door. The breaking point, when reality shatters and survival becomes impossible. Two voices outside are having a conversation about who is the real mother and who is the imposter. They're discussing details of your childhood, arguing about which one of them gave birth to you, debating which one loves you more. The psychological assault is so intense that you feel your grip on reality beginning to slip. This is the moment when Viking winter survival crosses from physical endurance into psychological warfare against forces that may not even exist. You check the alcove again, and now your mother is there, sleeping peacefully under her furs, but the voices outside continue their debate. And one of them is calling your name, asking you to choose which mother is real. The contradiction is impossible. Your mother can't be both inside and outside simultaneously. Yet your senses are telling you that she is. This is the phenomenon that broke more Viking minds than starvation, cold, or isolation combined. Medieval texts describe how families would reach the breaking point, a moment when the accumulated psychological stress of winter survival would cause complete mental collapse. People would become unable to distinguish between reality and hallucination, between the living and the dead, between safety and danger. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that some longhouses contained reality anchors, physical objects that families would use to maintain their connection to the real world when psychological phenomena became overwhelming. These included polished stones that reflected accurate images, carved wooden tallies that recorded actual events, and metal objects that remained cold to the touch and couldn't be manipulated by spirits. The voices outside suddenly stop arguing and begin singing together, a lullaby that your mother used to sing when you were a child. The harmony is perfect, as if the same person is singing with herself, creating a musical experience that's both beautiful and terrifying. The psychological manipulation has reached a level of sophistication that suggests something beyond simple hallucination. Modern studies of extreme isolation show that the human brain can produce incredibly complex false experiences when deprived of normal sensory input. The mind will create entire alternate realities, complete with consistent characters, detailed storylines, and emotional experiences that feel completely authentic. These false realities can be so convincing that people will choose them over actual reality, leading to psychological conditions that are essentially indistinguishable from psychosis. But the Vikings understood that these experiences served a purpose. The psychological pressure of winter survival was so intense that the mind needed escape. Valves, ways to process trauma, fear, and desperation that couldn't be handled through normal psychological mechanisms. The spirits, the visitors. The doppelgangers weren't just hallucinations, they were therapeutic tools that allowed people to externalize their internal conflicts and work through them in symbolic form. The singing outside begins to fade, and you realize that the voices are moving away from the longhouse. But as they recede, you hear something that makes your blood turn to ice. One of the voices is calling goodbye, and it's not your mother's voice anymore, it's yours, saying farewell to your family as if you're the one leaving. You look around the longhouse and see your family members staring at you with expressions of confusion and fear. Your brother Magnus points at you and asks, "If you're outside, then who are you?" The question hangs in the air like a physical presence, and you realize that you can't answer it. You're not sure who you are anymore, or where you are, or whether what you're experiencing is real or just another layer of winter madness. The final test, when survival demands the ultimate sacrifice, standing in the center of the longhouse. But you're not sure if you're really there or if you're outside in the snow. Looking in at your family through the windows, the boundary. Between inside and outside, between self and other, between real and unreal has completely dissolved. This is the state that Vikings called winter death, when a person's mind died even though their body continued to function. But within this psychological dissolution, you discover something that your ancestors understood, that survival sometimes requires the complete abandonment of individual identity. The person you were before winter began, with specific memories, desires, and fears, was a luxury that the season couldn't support to survive. You had to become something else entirely. Archaeological evidence from the most extreme Arctic settlements shows that some Viking families developed identity sharing, a psychological adaptation where individual personalities would merge into collective consciousness during the worst winters. People would lose their sense of separate selfhood and begin thinking, feeling, and acting as parts of a single organism focused entirely on survival. The voices outside have stopped, but now you hear something more disturbing. Silence. Complete, absolute silence that feels like a physical presence pressing against the walls of the longhouse. This is the silence of death. The silence of a world where nothing moves, nothing breathes, nothing lives. And within this silence, you make a discovery. That changes everything. You realize that the voices weren't coming from outside at all. They were coming from inside the longhouse, from the minds of your family members who had been sharing the same collective hallucination. The psychological stress of winter survival had synchronized your mind so completely that you were experiencing shared consciousness, thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same emotions, and projecting the same false realities. This is the final test of Viking winter survival, the moment when you must choose between maintaining your individual sanity and preserving the collective ability to function. Some people would choose to retreat into private madness, becoming unable to contribute to family survival, but maintaining their sense of self. Others would choose to merge with the collective consciousness, losing their individuality but gaining the psychological strength that comes from shared experience. Medieval texts describe how families would hold choosing ceremonies. During the darkest parts of winter, formal rituals where each member would decide whether to remain an individual or become part of the collective. These weren't just symbolic events. They were practical decisions that determined survival strategies for the remainder of the winter. The silence outside is broken by a new sound, your own voice, calling from somewhere beyond the walls. But this time, you know that the voice is real because you're speaking it. You're simultaneously inside the longhouse and outside in the snow, experiencing multiple versions of reality that are all equally true. This is the moment when Viking winter survival transcends ordinary human experience and becomes something else entirely, a form of consciousness that exists only in the extremes of human endurance. You are no longer just surviving winter. You're becoming winter, integrating with the season so completely that you and the cold become indistinguishable. The test is almost over, but passing it will require a sacrifice that will change you forever. You must choose which version of yourself will survive until spring, knowing that the others will die in the darkness. The choice of souls. When identity becomes currency for survival, you're facing the most impossible decision of your life. Which version of yourself deserves to live until spring? The person you were before winter began, optimistic, individual, attached to personal memories and desires, is dying from the psychological strain of survival. But a new version of yourself is emerging, harder, more collective, less human, but more capable of enduring the impossible. This is the phenomenon that Viking winter survivors called soul splitting, the moment when the mind fragments into multiple identities. As a survival mechanism, medieval Icelandic texts describe how people would literally become different people during winter, adopting new personalities that were better equipped to handle extreme conditions. These weren't just temporary adaptations, they were permanent, psychological changes that lasted long after winter ended. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that some individuals maintain multiple sets of personal belongings. as if they were preparing for different versions of themselves to inhabit the same body. These identity caches included different tools, different clothes, and different personal items that corresponded to different psychological states. The Vikings understood that survival might require becoming someone else entirely. The choice you're facing isn't just personal, it's collective. Your family is watching you struggle with this decision. And they're making their own choices about which versions of themselves to preserve. Your brother Magnus has already chosen. He's become someone colder, more calculating, more willing to make decisions that the old Magnus would have found horrifying. Your mother has chosen to become more maternal, more nurturing, but also more willing to sacrifice individuals for the survival of the group. The psychological mechanism behind soul splitting is what modern psychology calls dissociative identity disorder, a condition where trauma causes the mind to create separate personalities to handle different aspects of survival. But the Vikings didn't see this as a disorder, they saw it as adaptation. The person who could survive winter wasn't the same person who could thrive in summer, and trying to maintain the same identity year-round was a recipe for psychological destruction. The most disturbing aspect of soul splitting was the selection process. Families would hold soul councils, formal meetings, where each member would present their different identities, and the group would decide which versions were most useful for survival. The rejected identities would be ceremonially killed, deliberately suppressed until they faded away entirely. You present your options to your family, the old version of yourself who values individual happiness and personal relationships, or the new version who prioritizes collective survival and emotional detachment. The choice seems obvious from a survival perspective, but the psychological cost is enormous. Choosing the survival identity means killing the person you used to be, with no guarantee that you'll be able to resurrect them when spring returns. The family council reaches its decision quickly. The old version of yourself is too weak to survive the remaining months of winter. The new version is harder, more practical, more willing to make the choices that will keep everyone alive. The transformation is immediate and irreversible. You feel the old version of yourself dying, not metaphorically, but as a genuine death. Experience, memories fade, emotional attachments dissolve, and personality traits that defined you for decades simply cease to exist. In their place, something new emerges, a version of yourself that's perfectly adapted to winter survival, but fundamentally different from the person you used to be. The sun will return in a few weeks, but the person who greets it won't be the same person who watched it disappear months ago. The return of light when the sun rises on strangers, it's February 21st, 892 AD. And you're standing outside the longhouse watching the sunrise for the first time in 4 months. The light is painful, not just bright, but emotionally overwhelming. You become so adapted to darkness that the return of light feels like an assault. And you realize that the person experiencing this sunrise is fundamentally different from the person who watched the sun disappear. This is the moment that Viking winter survivors called the awakening, when families emerge from their longhouses to discover that they had become strangers to themselves and each other. The psychological transformations necessary for winter. Survival had changed them so completely that they needed to relearn how to be human and light. Archaeological evidence from Icelandic settlements shows that spring was often more dangerous than winter for Viking families. The mortality rate actually increased during the first weeks after the sun's return, as people struggled to adapt to normal life after months of extreme survival conditions. The skills that had kept them alive during winter, emotional detachment, calculated cruelty, collective consciousness, became liabilities in the world of light and warmth. The person you've become during winter is supremely adapted to survival conditions, but poorly equipped for normal social interaction. You've lost the ability to form emotional attachments, to experience joy or sadness in typical ways, to value individual life over collective survival. These changes were necessary for survival. But they make you a stranger to your own family. Your brother Magnus stands beside you. But he's not the same Magnus who entered winter with you. He's become someone harder, more suspicious, more willing to abandon the weak for the benefit of the strong. Your mother has become more maternal, but also more ruthless, capable of sacrificing individuals for the survival of a group. The family that survived winter together is composed of people who didn't exist before the darkness began. Medieval texts describe how Viking families would hold recognition ceremonies. During the first weeks of spring, formal rituals where family members would reintroduce themselves to each other and negotiate new relationships based on their transformed identities. These weren't just social customs. They were psychological necessities for preventing family violence and community breakdown. The most disturbing aspect of the awakening was the phenomenon of spring strangers. People who had changed so completely during winter that their families no longer recognized them as the same individuals. Some winter survivors would be unable to remember their pre-winter lives, while others would remember but feel no emotional connection to their former selves. The sunlight reveals the physical cost of winter survival. You've lost over 40 pounds. Your teeth are loose from malnutrition, and your skin has a gray pallor that will take months to fade. But the psychological costs are more severe. You've lost the ability to trust, to love unconditionally, to value life for its own sake rather than for its survival utility. The return of light also brings the return of memory, not just personal memories, but collective memories of all the things that happened during the dark months, the cannibalism, the abandonment of the weak, the psychological torture of isolation. All of it comes flooding back with the sunrise, creating a form of post-traumatic stress that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But you've survived, and survival is the only victory that matters in the Viking world. The sun is rising, spring is coming, and life will continue, changed, damaged, but ultimately victorious over the darkness. The spring reckoning, when survival becomes memory and becomes Cursair sitting in the spring sunlight. Warm for the first time in months, but you can't stop shivering. The trembling isn't from cold, it's from the memories that are. Flooding back now that your mind has space for something other than survival. Every choice you made during the dark months. Every person you failed to save. Every line you crossed to stay alive. It's all coming back with the clarity of daylight. This is the phenomenon that Viking winter survivors called spring sickness. A form of psychological collapse that occurred when people had to confront the reality of what they had done to survive. Medieval texts describe how some individuals would become catatonic during the first weeks of spring, unable to process the moral weight of their winter actions. Others would become violent, turning their survival instincts against family members who reminded them of their darkest choices. Archaeological evidence from Faroe Island settlements shows that some Viking communities built confession stones, large rocks where winter survivors would go to speak aloud about their experiences, purging themselves of the psychological burden of survival. These stones were often located far from the main settlement, allowing people to confront their memories without traumatizing others who were struggling with their own reckonings. The most disturbing aspect of spring sickness was the way it affected relationships. Families who had survived winter together often couldn't bear to look at each other once the sun returned. They had seen each other at their worst, making choices that revealed the animal nature beneath human civilization. The bonds that had held them together during survival now became sources of shame and trauma. Your brother Magnus hasn't spoken to you since the sun returned. He knows that you watched him choose to let your elderly uncle die rather than share scarce food resources. And you know that he watched you participate in the decision without protest. The complicity that enabled survival now makes normal family relationships impossible. The physical signs of spring sickness were unmistakable. Winter survivors would experience persistent nightmares, sudden violent outbursts, and periods of dissociation where they would relive winter experiences as if they were still happening. Some would become obsessed with hoarding food, unable to trust that abundance would continue. Others would become unable to eat normally. their bodies rejecting food that their minds associated with the guilt of survival. Medieval medical texts describe how Viking communities developed specific treatments for spring sickness. These included ritual purification ceremonies, physical labor designed to exhaust the mind, and communal storytelling where survivors would share their experiences to normalize their trauma. The most effective treatment was often simply time. The gradual fading of winter memories as the warmth of spring created new experiences to replace the old ones. But some memories never faded. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking winter survivors would leave their communities permanently after spring, unable to live with the people who had witnessed their survival choices. They would become wanderers, traders, or raiders, people who had been so changed by winter that they could no longer function in normal society. The Spring Reckoning wasn't just about individual trauma. It was about the collective understanding that survival sometimes requires abandoning the values that make life worth living. The families that survived winter together had to decide whether to maintain their connections despite the trauma, or to dissolve their bonds and try to rebuild their lives with people who hadn't witnessed their darkest moments. You're still shivering in the warm sunlight, and you realize that some part of you will always be cold, always be hungry, always be calculating the survival value of every person and every choice. Winter is over, but its effects will last forever. The echo of winter's grip. You stand in the ruins of what was once Hidibi, the great Viking trading center, now silent under a blanket of snow that has fallen for centuries since those desperate winter nights. The wooden longhouses have long since rotted away, but beneath your feet lie the remnants of the most ingenious survival system ever devised by humans facing the abyss of Nordic winter. The archaeological evidence tells a story that would make modern survival experts weep with admiration. In 2019, researchers at the University of Copenhagen discovered something extraordinary in the permafrost layers of former Viking settlements. Perfectly preserved samples of the fermented shark meat that kept entire communities alive when the sun disappeared. For months, the chemical analysis revealed that this putrid delicacy contained exactly the right balance of vitamins and fats needed to prevent scurvy, night blindness, and the bone-softening disease that claimed so many medieval populations. But the Vikings' winter survival wasn't just about food preservation or architectural innovation. It was about something far more profound, the complete reorganization of human society around the reality of death. Every custom, every ritual, every social structure was designed with the understanding that most people would not survive to see another spring. The winter drinking halls weren't just places of merriment. They were carefully orchestrated psychological operations designed to maintain group cohesion when individual survival instincts would otherwise tear communities apart. Modern psychologists studying seasonal affective disorder have found that the Viking approach to winter darkness was remarkably sophisticated. The ritualized storytelling, the communal sleeping arrangements, the strategic use of alcohol and fermented foods, all of these created a neurochemical environment that prevented the mass suicides that plagued other Northern European populations. The Vikings didn't just survive winter. They transformed it into a crucible that forged the most successful expansion culture in medieval history. Today, as climate change pushes extreme weather events to new limits, survival experts are returning to Viking techniques. The U.S. military's Arctic Survival Manual now includes references to Norse food preservation methods. Scandinavian architects are incorporating Viking heating principles into modern eco-friendly buildings. Even NASA has studied Viking psychology protocols for long-duration space missions, recognizing that the mental challenges of surviving in isolation mirror those faced by astronauts traveling to Mars. The bitter irony is inescapable. The Vikings, who terrorized medieval Europe with their raids and conquests, were themselves refugees from winter's merciless grip. Their legendary ferocity wasn't born from bloodlust, but from the desperate knowledge that only the strongest, most adaptable communities could survive the killing cold. Every raid was essentially a winter survival mission, a calculated risk to gather the resources needed to outlast another season of death. As you walk away from these ancient ruins, you carry with you the sobering truth that the Vikings discovered. Survival isn't about individual heroism or modern technology. It's about the willingness to transform your entire existence around the reality of nature's indifference. They survived the coldest nights not by conquering winter, but by surrendering to it completely, rebuilding their humanity around the simple, terrible fact that most of us will die, and only the most ingenious communities will endure. That cuts through your jacket is the same wind that howled through their longhouses 1,000 years ago. The difference is that they listened to what it was telling them.